June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The pencil trembled slightly in Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt's hand as he wrote in his hidden diary, committing words to paper that, if discovered by his own officers, would surely have earned him solitary confinement. "The Americans must be lying to us," he scribbled. "No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts." Through the train window, he had just witnessed something that directly contradicted 3 years of fervent Nazi propaganda. Electric lights blazed from every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window, an endless constellation of electricity stretching across the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into suffocating darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had so confidently described as a decadent, collapsed America, electricity flowed like water. 1,850 hardened veterans of Erwin Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps stepped down from the passenger train, not crammed into cattle cars or stifling freight wagons, but in cushioned Pullman coaches, complete with dining services and comfortable sleeping berths. The entire population of Mahia seemed to have turned out to witness their arrival. What none of these German soldiers knew was that this moment would trigger the most profound psychological transformation in modern prisoner of war history, a systematic demolition of Nazi ideology through the sheer, undeniable display of American industrial capacity. The astonishing mathematics of Allied victory were being written, not in battle plans, but in staggering production statistics that would soon shatter every assumption these soldiers held about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The collapse of the Axis forces in North Africa had begun on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The numbers varied as scattered units continued to surrender over several agonizing days. The Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, men who had driven the British back to Egypt, who had earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself, were suddenly prisoners. Among them was Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, a veteran of the French campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, would provide historians with the most detailed and intimate account of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers. The journey from defeat to revelation began in the port of Oran, Algeria, as Radke and 30,000 other POWs waited in makeshift camps for transport ships. American efficiency was already beginning to crack their deep-seated preconceptions. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an organizational precision that far exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved, even at the height of its power. Identity cards were photographed and meticulously filed. Medical examinations were completed, inoculations administered, and Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German by American officers specifically trained for this moment. But the first real shock came with the food. Obergrenadier Hans Meyer, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later. "In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration." The Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial capacity. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in an astonishing 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, a fact that would have been dismissed as impossible propaganda if the Germans had known it. These vessels, produced at a rate of 3 per day at the peak of production, were returning from delivering vital supplies to the European theater. Rather than sail back empty, they now carried human cargo, up to 30,000 POWs per month by the summer of 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 provided the second phase of psychological demolition. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed account that survived in letters to his family after repatriation. "The ship's crew," he noted, disposed of more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. The American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long, Zimmerman wrote. They did this openly, without thought, not to mock us, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became floating classrooms in American power. POWs discovered that the vessel carrying them was just one of 2,710 Liberty ships that would be built during the war. Each one required 250,000 parts, assembled from components manufactured in 32 states. The engines, they learned from surprisingly talkative American guards, were built in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauffenberg, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we, and perhaps the British, possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war." August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of America shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for miles, its colossal cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted in his secret diary, lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked our industrial cities. The prisoners were formed into columns for the march to the waiting trains. Along the route, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them belonging to dock workers. In Germany, private automobile ownership remained a privilege of the wealthy and the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, remained a propaganda dream with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary laborers drove to work in their own cars, but nothing truly prepared them for the trains themselves. Not cramped boxcars, not the 40-and-8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses, that had carried German troops across Europe, but full passenger coaches. Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths. Dining cars with white tablecloths and gleaming silver cutlery. Observation cars with panoramic windows. Hauptmann Racky wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in their car. Air conditioning. In August, they had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that simply couldn't exist according to everything they had been told. Every small town blazed with illumination. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp, displayed brightly lit shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, parking lots full even at midnight. Obergrenadier Meyer, whose father was a Nazi party bloc leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers performed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every aspect of the operation demonstrated undeniable technological superiority. More disturbing still was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties into bins without a second thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished. Gefreiter Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they stopped in used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial power in full, jaw-dropping display. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each one larger than anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the train slowed as they passed the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. From massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood the implications immediately. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. They told us there were dozens more across the country." The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Werner, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion visible from the train. "We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat," he wrote. "But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible." The deeper the trains penetrated into America, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, while below them, barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. The prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, in endless quantities without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German POWs who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, when lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch break. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. "No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread." The guard bought them hamburgers from a stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without thinking, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not special. This was their normal food. The arrival at the camps themselves provided the next level of cognitive demolition. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941, all standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify, this miracle drug that we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfa drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today, we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to the employment of POWs in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything: the endless fields of corn and wheat, the factories running 3 shifts, the shops full of goods, the parking lots full of cars, the houses with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, Lang recorded. Not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the Negroes, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week. And this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural mechanization that defied comprehension. A single combine harvester, they learned, could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties. The farmers spoke casually of yields that would have been fantasy in Germany, 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime. When I mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better." The most devastating revelations came to those prisoners who worked near or in American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, POWs could work in industries that freed American workers for military production. This technicality allowed thousands of German prisoners to witness American industrial capacity firsthand. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as most young workers were in the military. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented the experience. Everything was automated. Electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant gained glimpses of the automotive industry's astounding conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. We could see the parking lots, wrote Obergrenadier Franz Kellner. Thousands of cars belonging to workers. Workers in Germany. Even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory workers drove to work. The guard told us many workers owned 2 cars, one for work, one for family use. We thought he was mocking us. By winter 1943, the cumulative impact of these observations was producing what American intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's office, documented increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Rowland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They still maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America." The camp newspapers, produced by the prisoners themselves, began reflecting this transformation. Der Ruf, the call, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners, found their audience increasingly receptive. Lieutenant Hermann Gotz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." The most devastating blow to Nazi ideology came from an unexpected source: the treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Italian POWs who agreed to cooperate were formed into Italian service units, given better quarters, increased pay, and more freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in American restaurants, some even dating American women. Hauptmann Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system." Christmas 1943 provided the most profound psychological impact. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities even invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Mahia sent in homemade cookies and cakes. Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This extraordinary kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. Oberleutnant Walter Muller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies. Yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness." What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power. The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream. Quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to comprehend such resources being lavished on enemies. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hans Fischer. "Better than German generals eat, better than party leaders." And this was not special. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. Prisoners who had been told Americans were uncultured barbarians discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, and scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints, something utterly impossible in Nazi Germany. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies. This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology." The camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a depiction of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that Americans would show such self-criticism to enemies. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker." In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is considered patriotic. Spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached its peak. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full, overwhelming might of American industrial capacity. The numbers told a story that no propaganda could counter. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day. They watched as workers assembled 700 boats per month, each one requiring 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmerman wrote, "Women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than our entire Navy built in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron, ore from Minnesota, and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale defied German comprehension. "This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak," wrote Obergrenadier Paul Hartmann. "I worked at Krupp before the war. I thought I understood industrial production, but this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel and spillage than we could produce." The workers complained about overtime while producing quantities we couldn't achieve with slave labor and double shifts. The summer 1944 harvest provided the final demolition of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing agricultural production that could feed the world. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships across an ocean of gold, each one harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers. They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined." In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. "They destroyed food to keep prices stable," wrote Gefreiter Otto Schultz. "Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to be allowed to send them to Germany to our families. The guards were sympathetic but explained it was impossible. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources." June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The sheer scale of the operation, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond Nazi Germany's wildest dreams. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. Gefreiter Friedrich von Thoben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources." Throughout their captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology even more than material wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and sentimental, POWs discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gefreiter Hans Miller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany. Enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Hauptmann Otto. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which seemed like propaganda, proved genuine. They prepared us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. The medical treatment particularly affected prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques and using advanced equipment. Prisoners received operations that would have been available only to the elite in Germany. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings." This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we never understood: the confidence of true power. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had produced remarkable results. Over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. The camp newspapers published articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. The program's success exceeded all expectations. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn oaths to Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. "We became missionaries for democracy," admitted Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarschall, in a 1975 interview. "Not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany." The transformation was so complete that American authorities worried about prisoners being too enthusiastic about American ways. Some requested to stay in America after the war. Others married American women they met through prison correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America in the 1950s. April 1945 brought the final, horrifying revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German POWs. Many initially refused to believe it, claiming it was propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually, letters from Germany confirming the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had maintained some pride in German honor despite military defeat now faced the complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated, but evil. Hauptmann Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant." As the war ended in May 1945, German POWs faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything they had believed. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own government. The last months of captivity were spent preparing for return to a destroyed Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was even announced, understanding that America would rebuild rather than punish Germany. They prepared us to rebuild our country, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Thoben. They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens. This generosity from victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. But they brought with them something precious: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. The German POWs who experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had seen industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic prosperity. They knew Reconstruction was possible because they had witnessed a society that had achieved it. Many former POWs rose to prominence in West Germany's Reconstruction. Hans Kroll, a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Co., became president of the European Commission. Rudiger von Wechmer, held at Camp Herne, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production. These lessons learned as prisoners shaped the new Germany. Historians have called the German POW experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Without coercion, without propaganda in the traditional sense, American industrial might and democracy converted hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program succeeded because it relied not on words, but on observation. Prisoners saw American society functioning at peak efficiency while treating enemies with dignity. They witnessed industrial capacity that made German production look primitive. They experienced a standard of living that exposed Nazi promises as fantasies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German POWs in America, concluded, America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The POWs were converted by prosperity. The statistics support this assessment. Of the 371,683 German POWs held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with only 2,222 total attempts recorded. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German POWs held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Obergrenadier Hans Veth, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meyer, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us. This changed us forever." At the 1985 reunion dinner, former Oberst Hermann Gotz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of the transformation. We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. We saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The magnitude of the German POW experience in America can be measured in stark statistics that reveal both the scale of the operation and its remarkable success. Camp infrastructure. Over 500 camps across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. 175 main camps with 325 branch camps. Camps built to house from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each. Construction completed in an average of 90 days per camp. Prisoner population: 371,683 German POWs, part of 425,871 total Axis POWs. Peak population in May 1945. Average of 20,000 new arrivals monthly in 1943, 30,000 monthly after D-Day, 60,000 monthly in final months of war. Labor contribution: 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, $230 million in labor value, 1940s dollars, 80 cents daily wage per prisoner. Prisoners filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape statistics: only 2,222 escape attempts from over 371,000 prisoners, 0.6%. 0 successful permanent escapes. Most escapees recaptured within 24 hours. No American civilians harmed by escaped POWs. Educational programs: 40,000 plus enrolled in educational courses. 135 camp newspapers published. 30,000 taking English classes. 15,000 in vocational training. University correspondence courses for 8,000. Post-war immigration: approximately 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the U.S. after the war. 12,000 plus maintained correspondence with American families. Average correspondence duration: 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business partners. Treatment assessment: 95% rated treatment as good or excellent. 74% believed captivity positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in learning about democracy. Less than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. The German POWs who experienced American industrial might didn't just witness history, they were transformed by it. Their captivity became education. Their defeat became enlightenment. And their imprisonment became liberation from the ideological chains of Nazism. In the end, America's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where the overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity accomplished what armies could not: the complete transformation of enemy minds. The POWs had arrived believing in German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. American industrial might was not just overwhelming. It was incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and tyranny. The trains that had brought them into captivity in 1943 had carried warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried architects of democracy. They had seen the future, and it worked. Their story stands as a testament to a profound truth. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not military might, but the simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's capacity to create abundance. The German POWs were stunned by American industrial might, but ultimately, they were converted by it. In their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war redemption and the final defeat of the Nazi dream. They returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses to what free societies could achieve. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built on foundations laid in American prison camps. where enemy soldiers learned that prosperity came not from conquest, but from freedom, not from racial superiority, but from human dignity, not from totalitarian control, but from democratic cooperation. The German POWs had arrived in America expecting to find a weak, divided nation on the verge of collapse. Instead, they discovered an industrial colossus of unlimited power and surprising humanity. They had come as prisoners of war, but left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its absolute peak. In their awe at American abundance lay the psychological seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic reconstruction of Germany. They had seen America, and they would never be the same. Their children would grow up in a democratic Germany allied with the United States, a partnership built on the transformation that began when 1,850 Africa Corps veterans stepped off a train in Mexico, Texas, and discovered that everything they believed was wrong. The story of German POWs in America is, ultimately, a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction but through demonstration, not through propaganda but through prosperity, not through hatred but through humanity. The German soldiers who witnessed American industrial might became the unwitting ambassadors of democracy, carrying back to their homeland the seeds of transformation that would bloom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history, accomplished not through force, but through the overwhelming evidence of what free people could achieve when they worked together. In the end, that was America's secret weapon, not just the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any nation in history, but the capacity to transform enemies into friends through the simple power of example. The German POWs were stunned by America's industrial might, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better world.